呢幾日喉嚨有啲敏感，即係一少少冷空氣就又痕癢，真係好論盡。
Sorry, I had a sore throat these past few days. Just now we were not talking about the general facilities of the building, but then you're actually affecting the entire DCS. That's why you're asking them to do it. I understand that in some ordinances, the administration might try to err on the safe side. So you just try to make sure that you do have the powers in case of need. But then in this case, I think even if you have the power, you might not be able to exercise it at all. And as the chair just said, we are trying to take into account the fact that there are bound to be people who are not cooperative. Because you're talking about a 30-year period, and in many buildings, there might be many different problems. Sometimes the landlord or the owners might have a lot of disputes with the management company, and many users might be affected. You talk about the power companies and also the power grid. Well, very often for the individual owners, the notice would be addressed to all owners or users. But then I'm just trying to play safe in case the notice is given to the management company. But then what if the company is plagued with problems? Then will it really take care of the individual owner's interests? You can't tell. And they may have many problems. So you will have to take this into account very carefully in the bill. Unless you say that you can't be bothered, then there must be a reason why you don't think that would be a problem for you. Well, from the engineering perspective, for the DCS system and also the cooling system within the building, actually these are two separate systems. So there is just a heat exchanges, so that there would be an exchange of the heat energy. So Mr. Chair, you are a professional, therefore I think you should understand it very well. So for the cooling system within the building, I don't think it would affect the DCS system. So Clause 18 is referring to very special circumstances. Mr. Lai has already given an example. Unless there is flooding, resulting in the water pumps from the DCS being damaged. And the PAS has also given an explanation, and I think she's reasonable. She said that for the cooling system of the building itself, it's a problem of the building rather than the DCS problem. So it's like the lighting system within a building, and therefore the EMSD does not have the responsibility nor the power to dictate how the system should be maintained or repaired. But then Clause 18 has made it clear right from the outset that if it has to do with the behavior of the user or an installation of the building, which might jeopardize or will jeopardize the operation or reliability of the services, then the director may issue an improvement notice, and the responsibility falls squarely on the user or the consumer. So I think that's the situation. But then can you make further clarification? It's about how the system would operate. I'll defer to Mr. Lai to respond. Thank you, Chairman. Chairman, you're right in explaining that from the engineering perspective, because the connecting point with the building would be the substation. Well, later on we can also arrange for a site visit for members to see for yourselves how it works. Because the substation is a relatively small structure, so that's where the heat exchanger will be installed. On the earlier point that I just made, I'll be elaborating on that. Well, for the improvement notice, it's not about a really emergency situation, because on emergency situations, as we said in earlier clauses, we would have to suspend or terminate the service right away. But then with the improvement notice, we believe that we can give them some time to improve the facilities. That's why we issue this notice. So it's not really like a really emergency situation. It's acceptable for us to allow for some time for them to make the improvement. If it's just minor, for example, if there is water leakage, then we just give them some time to repair the system. And if it's an emergency situation, then the earlier clauses would be able to deal with them. So depending on the circumstances, we issue improvement notices to make up for the problem. In other ordinances, for example, for building energy efficiency, we also adopt the same approach, so that some time will be allowed for the management company or the owner to improve the situation. With regard to the changing of the approved consumer, well, they will have to apply afresh for becoming an approved consumer. Well, other than submitting the application, they would also have to make certain undertakings. And they would also have to promise to deal with the situation, because in approving for someone to become the new approved consumer, if there are outstanding problems, then we will have to ask the new incoming approved consumer to promise that he'll be prepared to deal with the outstanding problems. So if the predecessor has not been able to resolve the problem, then the successor will have to promise that he'll be prepared to do the repair works. Can you also explain how you can notify the small users? So on the issue of notifying the small users. Yes, as we said at the earlier meeting, well, sometimes it's hard for the bill to be very specific about how the individual users can be informed. Let's say if the DCS system to the building has been affected, then if circumstances permit, the director will try to inform the individual users, for example, by putting up a notice at a conspicuous place at the entrance. And there is also an inquiry hotline set up by the department to deal with such inquiries. And should the bill be drafted in such a way that we will have to make it specific that a notice will have to be put up at the entrance in a conspicuous place? Well, it's hard, but then wherever possible, the director would make use of different ways and means to inform the affected parties, including the putting up of notice in the conspicuous place at the entrance. Mr. Wong? I don't think you are able to address the concerns raised by Mr. Chair. I think he's concerned that as far as we have gone so far, I don't know, maybe there are already provisions in the bill to deal with the situation, but then as of now, what he's most concerned about, and he hasn't really seen a clause which is able to deal with this. That is, in the event that the consumer has received your improvement notice, and still he cannot be bothered, he just ignores it, then for other government departments, like in dealing with unauthorized building structures, and if the user just pays no heed to government's advice to make improvements, then you can also take action to remove the structure first and then recover the cost from the offender later. But then in this case, you talk about the heat exchanger, and then after the heat exchanging, then the services will be provided to individual stories of the building. All right, that's the responsibility of the management of the building. But then if there is something wrong with the plant room, and if that leads to the entire system being affected, then of course the consumer will have to make things right, or else the entire system will collapse or break down. Then the EMSD will definitely have to take urgent action. or else the entire district could be affected, or the smaller areas would also be affected. So after action has been taken to rectify the problem, then are there provisions in the bill to say that, all right, you have not done your job properly, and as a result the entire system has been affected, that's why I'll have to make claims against you. So that's the example. So are there any provisions in the bill to deal with the situation? It's like the government removing unauthorized building structures or dangerous signboards. You can always recover the cost from the offender. So is there a clause enabling the administration to recover the cost from the offender? Well, in other cases, the attention has been paid to the minor detail involving the communication between the management office and the individual occupiers. All right, you might have issued the improvement notice to the management company, but then the individual users might be kept in the dark. And as no improvement has been made, you have to cut the service, and then the individual users would be hard hit, and the entire building can be affected. So according to the FSD's current practice, if fire safety equipment has to be improved, and if the building department wants to improve the facilities in a building, other than writing to the management office, they would also be writing to the occupiers of the building. So there would be two letters, one to the management company, the other to the individual owners, occupiers, and so on, so that everybody will be informed. So would you be doing the same in this case? Because according to my understanding here, in the future, the operation of the DCS will involve the publication of a detailed guideline. So in your reply to Mr. Chair, he may not be entirely happy with your answer. So in the future, will you be requiring the director to write to not just the management company but also the individual users? Because you also have to ensure the overall system can function properly. Would you have the power to claim to make a claim against the offender for the recovery of the costs incurred in repairing the system? All right, if it's about the individual building not maintaining the system properly, causing a disruption of service to the entire district, I don't think that's likely to happen, because the individual buildings system is pretty independent. So in the event that something is not working or functioning properly, then all they need to do is to suspend the supply to a particular building, and it's unlikely that the entire system will be affected. And I think Mr. Wong has already answered your wrong question. Earlier on, I've also asked a similar question, and the answer is that for many operational details in the future, they will be issuing a set of guidelines, and that will form part of the administrative measures. So I don't think it's good to put in the details as to how the individual users should be informed in the future. So in reality, there is a need or necessity for them to communicate properly with the users, but then legally, I think normally it should be the responsibility of the management company being the approved user or consumer. But then for other users in a building, of course, they should not be kept in the dark, and there is a genuine need for the management company to inform its tenants properly as to what is happening.
Mrs. Ma. Thank you, Chair. Thank you, members, for your questions. I think the explanation just given was reasonable. If I may comment on ways to notify the occupiers and the end users. We have already started the first phase of the operation. The EMSD itself has got many administrative guidelines. I don't think I can rule out the possibility that they have already got a guideline to make sure that end users will be notified. So we'll check with the EMSD to see other than putting up a notice, whether individual users would also be notified in writing. But of course, this can't be written into the bill because it is administrative. As to whether the entire system now will collapse, I don't think so. Like in the case of reduction of fees or waiver of fees, this is rather remote, but still in the bill will have to provide for such an extreme scenario so that the director can issue an improvement notice. The likelihood is very slim, but we still want to provide for it. As to whether the entire system may break down, Mr. Lai can comment on it. Mr. Lai, I think the chair has made it clear. Basically, it is a standalone system. So I think the operation of individual users may not and will not affect our entire system. I think basically what we're going to do is to cut off the water supply. Now, if it is worried that something done by an individual would affect the system as a whole, as I have said, we can rely on civil action to recover the damages. Other irregularities in the system, well, I think there are other legislation that can cover such things and ensure safety. Mr. Wong, will the bill be issued to the property management company, or will it go to each and every end user? I think everybody should be clear because we have been discussing this for a long time. You talk about the bill for payment. Mrs. Ma, thank you. Thank you for your question. Well, we're going to charge the buildings. So for each building, for each system, we have got an approved consumer. So we charge the approved consumer. It may be the property management company, so the bill will be issued to the property management company rather than individual occupiers. So it's up to the individuals to share the expenses. It's an arrangement between the approved consumer and the end users to see how the bill should be sort of broken down. I think there won't be other questions for Clause 18, right? Clause 19, Mrs. Mom. Clause 19 says out clearly that the director may in writing authorize a public officer of the EMSD to enforce the provisions in the bill. In addition, it is said that if so requested, the public officer should produce written proof that he has been authorized to perform a function. No questions? Then Clause 20. Clause 20, Mr. Chairman, that's about empowering the authorized officer to enter the building to inspect or to test certain things. Other than the inspection, installation, or testing, the authorized officer, if necessary, may enter a part of the building to, say, for example, suspend the service or terminate the service. For Kai-Tak phases 1, 2, 3, and 1, 2, and 3A, we are talking about non-domestic buildings. But then the clause would provide for future uses. For residential buildings or domestic buildings, the EMSD can only gain entry with the consent of the occupier of a building if it is residential. And then 23, the EMSD may seek assistance of any other person the officer thinks fit to exercise his power. This is because we have an operator for the district cooling service in Kai Tak, so we have to make sure that the EMSD officer may go there together with the operator's staff. Mr. Wong. Any other person, can you explain? According to what Mrs. Ma has said, any other person, does it mean a staff member of the property management company or the owner's corporation? I don't think it is good because there may be disputes. Maybe the bailiff or the police officers should be asked to help. Mrs. Ma, thank you for your question. If I may further explain 23, with the assistance of another person, the officer thinks fit. It's a matter of the EMSD who appoint an operator responsible for the entire cooling system, like the piping work, etc. Say, for example, inspection of the water meter is needed, then the EMSD officer will get the assistance of any other person the officer thinks fit. Say, for example, if the operator's assistance is needed to inspect a water meter, then this other person will be sort of called in. Or for the heat exchange, whether it is working smoothly and whether the meter has to be tested. All such things are to be done together with the EMS, is to be carried out by the EMSD officer and the contractors' employees. I think Mrs. Smart is being very kind-hearted. You are talking about minor things. But then for clause 20, 1C, it talks about suspension or termination. Then there may be an unpleasant scenario, and then there may be quarrels or controversies. For clause 23, you are talking about a very sort of peaceful scenario. I think it's too narrow in terms of the scope. I think you have to accommodate, you have to cater for someone who is unreasonable. You may have to call in the police, or the court may say that there is a debt or bankruptcy is likely. Then perhaps you may have to ask the bailiff to help you to turn off the tap. Another person the officer thinks fit. I don't think you should narrow the scope so much. Mr. Wong, I don't think the wording rules out your sort of scenario. For the example cited by Mrs. Ma, I think this may happen because for 19.1, we talk about an authorized officer. It has to be a public officer attached to the EMSD, so the director would authorize an EMSD staff member to be an authorized officer for the purposes of this ordinance. For an employee of the operator, he won't be regarded as an authorized officer, and that's why we need 23, so that the authorized officer can get somebody to help him if he thinks fit. I think this will happen all the time. Mrs. Ma has tried to answer Mr. Wong's question. As to the example referred to by Mr. Wong, I don't think 23 rules out that possibility. Thank you, Chair. I think the member is worried about 21C, suspension of service. He wonders whether the person in charge will become unreasonable or even assault the EMSD officers. Of course, in such a case, we need to call the police as to what will be the penalty. Clause 20 provides for the offences. If anybody is to obstruct an authorized officer to carry out his work, then it is an offence. So for clause 21(2), it says that the maximum penalty will be a fine at level 3 and imprisonment for 6 months. In other words, if it is found by the MSD that fees have not been paid and suspension has to be invoked, and if there is any obstruction, then it is likely to become an offence under clause 21. Alright, no other questions? Then I think we have already covered clause 21. Yes, clause 21 already. Any questions on clause 21? Let's take a look of the English rendition. Part 4, clauses 18 to 21. Any questions concerning the English version? I think it tallies with the Chinese version. Our LA, any questions? No? Then we move on to Part 5. Part 5 is rather long and is about appeals. Mrs. Ma, that's about appeals, and would like to provide for an appeal channel. Now, if somebody is aggrieved by certain decisions, then there is a channel of appeal. There are quite a large number of clauses, but I can sort of cut the long story short. We have already made reference to the arrangements of the appeal board under the Building Energy Efficiency Ordinance. Now, if somebody is aggrieved, he may lodge an appeal to an appeal board. If someone would like to become the consumer, and if he's rejected, then he may appeal against such a decision. And then for subsection 1B, that's about a decision to refuse to provide district cooling services to a building under section 6(2). Now, if there is disagreement over the appointed date of provision, such a decision is also susceptible to appeal. 1C. If a consumer has failed to carry out improvement under the improvement notice, or in the case of non-payment, if such actions result in suspension or termination, again, it is a decision which is appealable.
And then under D, if it's not a service breakdown, but then if there is a suspension of supply, then the consumer can apply for the service to be resumed, and if it's rejected, then the consumer can lodge an appeal. Fifth, if an approved consumer would like to apply under Section 9 to become an approved consumer, then if the application is rejected, he can also lodge an appeal. And then next, with regard to the improvement notice or the instructions under the improvement notice, if any party feels aggrieved, he or she can lodge an appeal. And G says that such appeals will not result in the director's instruction or decision not being effective. It's been said that will the appeal be abused, and under subsection 2, as the director's decision or direction will still be enforced despite the fact that there is an appeal, so that should also prevent any abuse of the system. All right, legal advisor, or Mr. Tony Chair. Chairman, of course we should have an appeal mechanism, and that should be supported. But then, from A to G, these are the circumstances under which appeals can be lodged. But then, what about the following situation? What if I receive a bill which I think has overcharged me, and I explain why I think I've been overcharged, and then if you disagree, then there is no way or nowhere that I can turn to for redress, and you just ignore my complaint, then is there anything that I can do about it? Now, coming back to clause 15 just now. Well, the director has the discretionary power to grant a fee waiver or a partial fee waiver, and of course there needs to be an application, and then the director will make a decision. So will that be final? So the decision rests entirely on the director, and there is no way that his decision can be challenged. But then, as far as I am aware, what are the in-principle considerations as to why the director thinks that it's appropriate to grant a fee waiver or a refund? So will you be leaving everything to the director when it comes to fee waiver and so on? Well, we will be talking about how the meter can be checked and how the system will operate. Yes, Chairman, you're right. Concerning the level of fees and charges, well, actually, that's been spelled out in the schedule of the bill, and the figures are very clear. And if there is any doubt, usually it's about the functioning or malfunctioning of the water meter. No, it's not that I have any doubt about the functioning or malfunctioning of the system. But then if I think that the calculation is unfair, then is there any way that I can challenge the decision? Because you talk about appeals, and of course people would only lodge an appeal if they feel aggrieved. So, Chairman, that's not my complaint. All right, whenever there is an appeal, of course there is an aggrieved party thinking that he has been wrong. That's why he'd like to lodge an appeal to the appeal board. That's the main problem. So I'm not doubting that there is anything wrong with the system. Of course, you have the mechanism in place. That's about the fee charging mechanism. That's in Part 3. And if you're still not happy with that, so will you be able to lodge an appeal, PAS? Thank you, Chairman. Let me now turn to the appeal mechanism. So it's about a decision made by the director, and if any party thinks that he has not been fairly treated, then he can resort to this appeal mechanism. As to what kind of decision are we referring to for fees and charges, well, we have this formula set out in the bill for individual users. If he thinks that the fees are not fair, then if it's a decision taken by the director and he thinks that it's not fair, then of course that would form the ground for lodging an appeal. But then on the fee level, for example, for the contract cooling services charges, so that's not a decision taken by the director. It's been spelled out in the Schedule 2 of the bill. So under what circumstances will the director be able to make a decision is about the capacity, the contract capacity, and so on. But then if we have already agreed on the contract capacity or contract cooling capacity, then under Clause 4, when an applicant makes an application to become an approved consumer, then he will have to sort out with the director as to what the details are. And if you think that the contract cooling capacity should not be like that, then these are technical issues. It's not just for the director to decide. So you will have to depend on the water meter in determining the extent of services that you have used. So I don't want to waste time on that if I feel aggrieved about the fees and charges, because, all right, you've issued me with a bill, and of course you have a system to counter-check. And if I think that it's not fair, then the only redress that I can have is to go to the court. Is that right? if the administration has imposed this on me, and if I am being targeted, for example, my company might have become the target, but then for appeals, those should be independent, right? So in the end, a decision has to be taken, and of course that's under the purview of the director. Then of course the director's decision will be final. Is that the case? Well, for the appeal board, with regard to its terms of reference, there is a definition here. So these are the cases where an appeal will be allowed. So as Mr. Chair just put it, in the scenario that he has painted, does it mean that the aggrieved party will have to go to the court? Well, in these circumstances, the appeal board will only be able to deal with decisions taken by the director under the bill. And of course, under the bill, if there are areas which have not been spelled out very specifically in the bill, and if you want to resort to the appeal board under the bill to deal with those cases, then that might not be appropriate, because basically the terms of reference of the appeal board have been spelled out very clearly here in this bill. So on clause 18, clause 15, the director's decision will be final. Is that the case? PAS. Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, Member, for your question. Well, under clause 15, as we just said, well, let me put it this way. It's not that the director would be making a decision on whether service should be provided to a particular building. So we are talking about a situation whereby the director would be looking at individual cases in deciding whether or not there should be a fee waiver or whatever. So it's not on the application by the consumer for the director to reduce the fees. But then what if the consumer would like to seek a fee waiver? But then these are discretionary powers. In other words, the director is exercising a discretionary power to reduce or waive the fee. In these circumstances, it's difficult to put it under the appeal mechanism, whereby the aggrieved party can lodge an appeal, unless we can spell out very clearly the circumstances under which the director has taken a decision, or that the consumer can apply for a fee waiver. And then if he feels aggrieved by the decision of the director, he can lodge an appeal. But then that's not what is now provided for under clause 15. We just have this clause available so that in the event that the director needs to exercise that power, he will be able to do so. We believe that putting this under the appeal mechanism would be somewhat difficult. Yes, Chairman, I understand what the PAS has said, because in the end, the discretionary power rests with the director, and therefore his decision is final. And in fact, I have also got this worry. I don't really have examples or certain principles under which fee waiver should be granted. But then we need to have checks and balances in order to make sure that the director would be exercising his discretionary power properly. He should be considering these on a fair basis, and there should be factors that he has to take into account. So can you give us some examples so that I can at least have some idea as to under what circumstances he might be exercising that power? All right, PAS, please think about it and see if you can come up with a response next time, because you referred to some circumstances, and we may need to empower the director to do so. But then there might be some actual circumstances under which he would really exercise that power. So please do try and give us some examples. And our legal advisor would also like to make some comments on the appeal mechanism. Legal advisor. Thank you, Chairman. In fact, on this bill, clause 22, I have two questions, and I'll be spelling that out. One is textual in nature, and the DFJ might help me. As you can see in bracket 1 or in subsection 1,
Positions and direction made in respect of 一啲嘢咁咯。咁啊中文就係咧，任何人如因。
Well, in Chinese, is 任何人如因就該人作出的以下任何決定或指示。So can the DFJ explain to us why you have got this additional 或? So it's about the construction of the sentence. And the DFJ might be able to help me. And the next one is about 22(1)(c) and D. It sets out the circumstances under which an appeal can be lodged. So, if it's a decision to suspend or terminate district cooling services to a building under Section 7(1)(b), C, or G, and then D, a decision not to resume district cooling services to a building under Section 8(2), where the services were suspended under Section 7(1)(b), C, or G. But then under 7, we have 1 to G. So we have A to G, but then under 7A is about the building without an approved consumer, and therefore it's not included in the system. But then under B, D, E, F, i.e. under 7D, E, F, right from the beginning, these are circumstances under which the director is of the view that if certain things have happened, then the director may suspend or terminate district cooling services to a building. So concerning the circumstances which, in the view of the director, should warrant a suspension or termination of district cooling services, then can a complaint be lodged? If that is the case, then can the administration clarify in accordance with which clause would a complaint be allowed to be lodged? Before I invite the DFJ to respond to the Chinese version, let me first refer to 7DEF, 7(1)DEF. That's in the director's opinion. Under 7(1)D, in the director's opinion, work is required to be carried out for the installation, inspection, blah, blah, blah. And in such an event, the services will have to be suspended. So it might have to do with the behavior of the consumer, or in the application he has not given certain details, so it's a technical issue. And under E is a malfunction or a fault in the system, so that could be unforeseen. And of course you can say that after the breakdown it can be resumed upon the functioning of the system again, and of course that would be automatically resumed upon the repair of the system. And then F, if it's necessary to do so to protect life or property, then of course the services will have to be suspended or terminated. Of course that has to do with some engineering issues, and if that should happen again, then of course the DCS can resume if the problem has gone. So I do not see any specific reasons why the affected parties should lodge an appeal on these grounds.
Whether there is a fault in the district cooling system, etc., I think this is not sort of amenable to an appeal mechanism. Well, members have reminded me that it's time to wrap up the meeting. So for clause 22, probably there will be other questions, and I don't think we can cover them all in today's meeting. So I suggest that we just end the meeting at this point, and then for the LA's question, probably you haven't answered it in full, so we can continue with that at the next meeting. Yes, we do have another meeting coming after this one, so thank you very much.